A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 2, Leonnatus, The Sacred Band. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 8, Science of Suffering. 7:30 a.m., Day 2, Great Gymnasium of Thebes. The second morning was worse than the first. The novelty of Thebes had been replaced by a deep, throbbing ache in every joint. Across the sprawling stone gymnasium, the brutal divide of the city was once again laid bare. While public cadets like 17, Iolaus 16, Cynane 15, Agis 14. Batas had already endured hours of punishing drills on empty stomachs since the early dawn. Philip and his fellow exiles, Antigonus, Peithon, Leonnatus, and Amyntor, arrived to face the Crucible head-on. Under the unyielding, hawk-like gaze of the Peithon tribes, they were driven back into the Boeotian dust. They ran grueling laps around the stone perimeter until the autumn air felt like liquid fire in their lungs. Beside the Macedonian princes, Iolaus pushed his exhausted body forward, his long stride maintaining a punishing rhythm, despite the cramps tearing at his lower abdomen. The second day always bites harder than the first, Iolaus thought grimly, swallowing the metallic taste of fatigue in his throat. Let the trainers watch. We'll outlast their switches. A few paces behind him, Cynane moved with cold, mechanical efficiency, her eyes fixed on the heels of the runner ahead. Every step burns like fire, but every lap brings us closer to breaking their mold, Cynane told herself. Her jaw clenched so tightly her teeth ached. They want to grind us into dust? We'll use that dust to blind them. Keep your head up, Peithon, Leonnatus hissed, his voice ragged as he pulled alongside his friend. If you stumble, the trainer's switch will find your back before you hit the dirt. My legs, they're made of lead, Peithon managed to gasp, his face slick with sweat and grime. 15-year-old Agis stumbled slightly on the uneven gravel, his shins flaring with agonizing pain from the previous days of marching. He looked over at 14-year-old Batas, who looked pale, hollow-eyed, and half-fainting from hunger. Stay with me, Batas, Agis muttered fiercely, reaching out to grab the younger boy's shoulder and steady his pace. Don't look at the ground. Look at my back. Just keep moving your feet. Batas blinked back tears of sheer exhaustion, his stomach cramping violently. I can't stop, Batas thought, a tremor running through his small frame. If I fall here, I'll never get back up. When the running finally ceased, there was no respite. They were driven into the Palaestra, grappling in the fine-grained sand of the wrestling pits. Here, the skin on their knees and elbows was rubbed raw, and their muscles screamed in protest against the constant tension. Philip found himself locked in a stalemate with Antigonus, both boys shivering from the effort of the clinch. Leverage, Antigonus, Philip whispered through gritted teeth, shifting his weight. The trainer said, it's not about brute weight. It's about the center of gravity, Antigonus grunted as he was forced back an inch into the grit. I don't care about gravity, Philip. I just want to sit down. Hold your ground, the Peithon tribes barked, the shadow of his heavy staff falling over them. A man who cannot stand in the dust will never hold his place in the phalanx. Between the bouts of wrestling, they were handed the heavy, balanced spears of the infantry. They practiced javelin throws until their shoulders felt as though they were being pulled from their sockets. The instructors watched for the snap of the wrist and the tilt of the shoulder, demanding a precision that felt impossible under such bone-deep fatigue. Leonnatus threw his heavy training spear, watching it wobble and fall short of the mark. He cursed under his breath. In Pella, we hunted boars from horseback. This is like trying to throw a mountain. Amyntor, standing nearby, drove his spear forward with grim, methodical repetition. They build us into cogs for their machine, Amyntor thought inwardly, his muscles burning. Every throw is a calculation of force and angle. Philip wiped the grit from his eyes, his gaze fixed on the Theban veterans training in the distance. It's not just a throw, Leo. It's a calculation. He adjusted his grip, feeling the sweat make the wood slick. The Thebans don't just build soldiers, they manufacture them. In the eyes of their masters, this was the essential tempering of the flesh, a systematic hardening process. As Philip watched his friends and the public cadets struggle side by side in the dirt, he realized that every bruise and every breath of dust was a necessary part of the science of suffering. Thebes was not just teaching them to fight. It was breaking their old selves to build something far more dangerous. From grit to harmony. 1,400 hours, shaded colonnades of the gymnasium. The transition was jarring. Only an hour ago, Philip, Antigonus, Peithon, Leonnatus, and Amyntor had been completely covered in the gritty dust of the wrestling pits, their skins stinging from the sun and the raw friction of the sand. Now, bathed and dressed in clean, simple linen tunics, they sat on low wooden benches in the cool, echoing shade of the stone colonnade. The harsh scent of training sweat had been replaced by the faint, sweet aroma of cedarwood, crushed olive leaves, and ancient parchment. "My fingers are still shaking from the javelin drills," Antigonus whispered, staring down at the delicate wooden lyre resting on his lap as if it were a fragile bird. "How am I supposed to pluck a clean string when I can barely close my fist around a cup?" "With precision, not strength, Antigonus," Philip replied quietly, though he too was flexing his stiff, aching hands, feeling the phantom pull of the morning's heavy spears. That's what the tutor said. The exact same hand that breaks a shield line must be capable of grace. Peithon groaned softly, leaning his head back against a cool stone pillar. "I'd rather run 10 miles in armor than sit here, trying to make music out of sheep gut," Peithon thought inwardly, glaring at the instrument. "The Thebans are mad. They fight like demons, then sit around plucking strings like poets." Their tutor, a lean Pythagorean scholar with silvered hair and eyes that seemed to pierce right through stone, struck a single, resonant note on his own large kithara. The pure, bell-like sound echoed cleanly through the quiet courtyard. "In the morning, you learned the brutal harmony of the body," the tutor began, pacing slowly before the benches, his dark gaze sweeping over the young exiles. "Now we study the higher harmony of the soul. Music is not merely sound for entertainment, ephebes. It is number made audible. The intervals between the strings are governed by the exact same mathematical ratios that dictate the movement of the celestial stars and the precise spacing of a victorious phalanx." Peithon leaned toward Philip, a thoroughly skeptical look twisting his features. "Do you actually believe that nonsense?" Philip Peithon muttered under his breath. "That strumming a song makes you a better soldier? Look at the sacred band when they train," Philip murmured back, his eyes fixed on the tutor's hands. "They march to the haunting rhythm of the Iolaus, Peithon. They don't need a frantic commander screaming orders over the din because they already have the rhythm carved into their blood. If you can't find the harmony here in the quiet, you'll never find it when the line crashes in battle." Amyntor sat a few paces away, his fingers lightly tracing the grain of his lyre. "They use music to wire discipline into their nervous systems," Amyntor analyzed coldly within his own thoughts. "It is an art. It's conditioning disguised as culture." The lesson quickly shifted from the lyre to the wax tablet and stylus. The tutor began to sketch complex geometric proofs in the wax, explaining how rigorous logic was the ultimate unbreakable defense against the chaotic panic of the human mind. "If a political statement is truly valid, it must be completely consistent," the tutor challenged, stopping before Leonnatus and fixing him with a penetrating stare. "If a king declares he loves his people and protects his realm, yet willfully leaves his borders wide open to invaders, is he a wise king or dangerous liar?" Leonnatus shifted uncomfortably on the bench, a dark flush rising up his neck. "He's talking about Pella," Leonnatus thought, his jaw tightening defensively. "He's talking about our fathers and uncles." In Macedon, Leonnatus spoke aloud, his voice dropping defensively. "A king is a king simply because he has the biggest sword and the royal bloodline." "And that," Philip interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through the colonnade with a sudden authoritative ring that made even the tutor blink, "is why we are constantly at war with ourselves back home. We have the sword, but we completely lack the logic to know where or why to strike." The tutor nodded slowly, a thin, approving smile touching his lips as his gaze lingered on the young prince. "Precisely, Prince Philip. Logic is the geometry of the human mind. Without it, your raw courage is merely a wild, unguided wildfire that inevitably burns itself out." As the afternoon sun began to cast long, golden, slanting shadows across the stone courtyard, the 5 exiles sat in a rare, heavy silence. The physical exhaustion of the morning's torture had now been layered with an entirely new, crushing kind of mental weight. "I used to think the Thebans were just incredibly lucky at Leuctra," Peithon said quietly, staring down at the complex geometric equations etched into his tablet. "I was wrong. They didn't just stumble into victory. They simply did the math while the Spartans were still standing around counting their old scars." Philip slowly ran his thumb over the polished wooden frame of his lyre. A profound, piercing realization settled deep into his chest. The afternoon lessons were the true, well-guarded secret of Theban hegemony. The wrestling pit and the morning runs made them strong, but the music, the geometry, and the cold logic made them an unbreakable unit. He wasn't just learning how to survive as a hostage or how to fight as a common soldier. He was learning the exact architectural blueprint of how to build a nation from the soul upward. Breath of the beast. Early afternoon, plain of Isthmus outside Thebes. The winter sun hung low and pale over the Boeotian plain, casting long, razor-thin shadows across the frosted grass. Philip and his boys, Antigonus, Peithon, and Leonnatus, stood on a low rise, their cloaks pulled tight against the biting wind. Beside them stood Batas and Pamines, their expressions unreadable, like statues of weathered bronze. Below them, the 300 men of the sacred band were no longer a collection of soldiers. They had become a singular, terrifying machine. At the center of the formation stood Amyntor, his crestless helm catching the light as he moved among the ranks, adjusting the angle of a shield or the set of a shoulder. "Watch their feet," Batas whispered, not looking at the boys, but at the dust rising from the formation. Most men march. The band dances. At a sharp signal from the Iolaus player, a haunting rhythmic melody that seemed to pulse from the earth itself, the band began to move. They didn't charge with the wild, screaming abandon the Macedonian boys were used to seeing in the north. Instead, they advanced in a slow, hypnotic cadence. "See the left wing?" Philip asked, his voice barely a breath. "It's deeper." "Why is it so deep, General?" "It is the hammer, Philip," Pamines answered, his eyes tracking the massive column. "The Spartans expect an even line. Epaminondas gives them a mountain. 50 ranks deep of men who breathe as one. When that mass hits the enemy's place of honor, the world breaks." The boys watched as the formation pivoted. It was a maneuver of staggering complexity. The entire left wing swung forward like a closing door, while the right wing stepped back, refusing the engagement. There was no shouting, no confusion. Only the rhythmic clack-thud of sandals and the shimmering ripple of sunlight off 300 polished shields. Epaminondas raised his spear, and the band halted as one man. The silence that followed was more deafening than the music. "Look at their eyes," Leonnatus remarked, leaning forward. "They aren't looking at us. They aren't even looking at the horizon. They're looking at the man next to them." "That is the bond we spoke of," Batas said, finally turning to the boys. "Each man in that line has sworn to die before he lets the man beside him fall. You are watching 300 hearts beating in a single chest. Against that, no wall, no king, and no god can stand." Philip watched as Epaminondas walked to the front of the line, his presence commanding a gravity that seemed to pull the very air toward him. The Prince of Macedon felt a strange, cold shiver that had nothing to do with the winter wind. He wasn't just seeing a tactical drill. He was seeing the end of the old way of war. "If we had this in Pella," Peithon whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement, "the Illyrians would be gone in a moon's turn." "Not just the Illyrians," Philip murmured, his gaze fixed on the interlocking shields of the sacred band. He realized then that the Thebans had found the ultimate secret. That war was not a contest of heroes, but a triumph of harmony. He looked at Antigonus, Peithon, and Leonnatus, seeing in their stunned faces the same dawning realization. They were the students today, but they were already beginning to imagine themselves as the masters of this lethal music. Path of the Bronze, General's Decree. Late afternoon, strategy room, Thebes. The low, slanting sunlight of late afternoon filtered through the high, narrow windows of the Cadmea, illuminating the rising dust motes dancing around the heavy oak table. Generals Batas and Pamines stood before the 4 Macedonian exiles Philip, Antigonus, Peithon, and Leonnatus, alongside Amyntor, who stood silently at their flank, his jaw set in rigid concentration. This was no classroom lesson in poetry, arithmetic, or the philosophy of the soul. It was the cold, unyielding revelation of their military future. "You look at the sacred band and you see an impassable wall of bronze," Batas began, his deep, resonant voice echoing sharply against the damp stone walls. "You watch them wheel and think it is mere talent. But that wall is built in stages, meticulously forged over years of sweat and sacrifice. To stand among them, you must follow the path of the Ephebeia. You are royal exiles, yes, but while you draw breath in Thebes, you are under my absolute command. Here is how we will temper you. Phase 1, the Ephebeia, ages 14 to 17, the tempering. You are currently 14, entering the fire, Pamin said, slowly pacing back and forth before the boys, his hands clasped behind his back. You are in the first stage. Your bones are still growing, your mind still wild, and your body soft compared to what is coming. For the next 3 years, you will be relentless students of the Peta tribes. The focus, building the body of bronze. You will wrestle in the pits until the fine-grained sand is your second skin. You will run the perimeter tracks until your breath is a wheeze of liquid fire. The instruction, you will learn the philosophy of the phalanx, understanding that your life does not belong to yourself anymore. It belongs entirely to the man standing to your left. The constraint. At this age, Pelopidas interjected, his gaze snapping sharply to Philip. You lack the bone density and mass to withstand the isthmus, the literal bone-crushing shove of 1,000 men colliding in the push. You will not stand in the front line yet. For now, you are the shadow of the army, not its weight. Antigonus shifted his weight slightly, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides. 3 years of just the groundwork, Antigonus thought bitterly, staring at the scratches on the oak table. They mean to strip away every trace of Pella until nothing is left but muscle and obedience. Phase 2, the junior phalanx, ages 18 to 20, the integration. When you reach your 18th year, Pammines continued, pausing to gesture broadly to a detailed map of the Boeotian border spread across the table. The swaddling clothes of the schoolroom come off. You will step into the ranks as legal auxiliary soldiers of the League. Cooperation, you will transition from heavy wooden staves to lethal, bronze-tipped pikes. You will be assigned to active border patrols and volatile garrison duty across the frontier. The sweet spot. This is where you begin to actively cooperate with the sacred band. You will act as the supporting rear ranks or the refused wing in our signature oblique formations. You will learn to move, march, and wheel at the exact, unbroken stride of the elite. The bond, this is when your covenant will be forged in blood and terror. You will learn to stay utterly calm when enemy arrows hiss through the sky and the very earth trembles beneath your greaves. Peithon swallowed hard, his eyes tracing the borders marked on Pammins' map. Auxiliary service on the border, Peithon thought, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. That's not training anymore. That's actual blood, actual ambushes, and actual death. Phase 3, full elite status, ages 20 to 30, the spearhead. Pelopidas stepped forward, his boots clicking heavily against the stone floor. He reached out, placing a heavy, calloused hand firmly onto Philip's shoulder. The sacred band itself is the prime of a man's life, Pelopidas said, his voice dropping to a fierce, compelling register. To be a protostates, a front ranker who meets the enemy spear tip first, you must be at least 20. You must be a finished weapon, incapable of breaking. The role, the razor-sharp spear tip that shatters Spartan shields and breaks the center line of empires. The expectation, total tactical fluidity. By 20, you should be able to hear the haunting melody of the Iolaus and know instinctively, without a single shouted word, how to pivot the entire line in absolute synchronicity. Leonnatus clenched his jaw so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. 16 more years of this life, Leonnatus thought, a strange mixture of dread and dark fascination washing over him. They aren't holding us hostage, they're turning us into weapons of mass destruction. Amyntor narrowed his eyes, his mind calculating the sheer temporal weight of the decree. By the time we return to Macedon, we won't be boys asking for a throne, Amyntor realized inwardly. We will be a conquering force. Do you understand, young lions? Pelopidas asked, his dark eyes burning with unrelenting expectation as he swept his gaze across the 5 Macedonian youths. Thebes is not just a place of exile or a political cage. It is the divine forge that will decide whether you return to Pella as rightful kings who can command the world, or merely as broken men who were once temporary hostages. Philip looked down at the map, then across at his companions, Antigonus, Peithon, Leonnatus, and Amyntor. The immense, crushing weight of the years ahead, of the discipline, the sweat, and the inevitable blood, settled deep into his young eyes. Yet beneath that weight flickered an unquenchable, blazing fire. "We understand, General," Philip replied, his voice steady, ringing with a profound, unshakable resolve that seemed to age him 10 years in a single breath. We will be the iron you require. Eve of the Architect, 20 p.m., dining hall of Pamenes' residence. The atmosphere in the dining hall was a warm, golden sanctuary against the biting Boeotian night outside. Braziers filled with glowing charcoal chased away the damp chill, and the rich, savory scent of roasted pork seasoned with garlic and wild thyme hung heavy in the air. Philip sat on a low cushion at the central table, his muscles humming with the dull, throbbing ache of a day spent studying the physics of ramparts, the grit of the wrestling pits, and the crushing weight of the general's decree. Flanking him closely at the table were his companions, Antigonus, Peithon, Leonnatus, and Amyntor, each sharing the quiet, bone-weary silence of boys pushed to their physical limits. Pamenes sat at the head of the table, his manner relaxed yet intently observant. Beside him was Batas, who tore into a piece of barley bread with the same focused, aggressive vigor he displayed on the battlefield. "Eat well, Philip, and eat well, you young lions," Batas said, gesturing with a wine-stained crust toward the loaded platters. He swept his dark gaze across Antigonus, Peithon, Leonnatus, and Amyntor. "The strength of an army starts in the belly. You've had a long, grueling day of physical engineering and tactical planning, but tomorrow requires a different kind of endurance entirely." Antigonus paused with a piece of roasted pork halfway to his mouth, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Different endurance. Antigonus thought inwardly, a cynical eyebrow twitching. If it involves more running in the dust or being thrown in the Palaestra, my ribs might actually fracture. Philip looked up from his plate, his interest instantly piqued, cutting through his exhaustion. "More siegecraft, General? Or are we returning to the Palaestra for dawn drills?" Pamenes shared a knowing, significant look with Batas before turning back to the young prince and his companions. "Neither. Tomorrow at dawn, you will not meet the Pater tribes at the gymnasium. You will be meeting Epaminondas himself at the upper training grounds of the Cadmea." A sudden, sharp, breathless silence fell over the table. To any student of war in the 4th century, the name Epaminondas was spoken with the kind of absolute reverence usually reserved for the Olympian gods. He was the brilliant tactical innovator who had shattered the invincibility of the Spartan myth at Leuctra, turning the entire course of Hellenic history through sheer intellectual will. Peithon dropped his wooden cup against the table with a soft clack, his eyes widening in stunned disbelief. Epaminondas? Peithon thought, a cold shiver racing down his spine. The man who broke Sparta. "We are going to stand before him? He wishes to see us?" Philip asked, his voice remarkably steady as he processed the crushing weight of the invitation, though his fingers tightened instinctively around his cup. "The first strategist himself? He has heard of your progress with the geometry of ruin from Ismenias," Pamenes explained, leaning forward into the warm amber light of the oil lamps. "And I have told him that you and your companions possess a rare, ravenous mind for the patterns of the field, not just the brute force of a spear. He wishes to see if the Macedonian lions are truly as sharp as they are fierce." Leonnatus clenched his jaw, a knot of nervous tension twisting deep in his stomach. "They aren't just testing Philip," Leonnatus realized, his gaze shifting to Amyntor and Antigonus. "They are testing all of us. If we stumble before the architect of Thebes, we shame every name in Pella." Pelopidas wiped his hands on a linen cloth and fixed his intense, unblinking gaze upon the young Macedonian exiles. "Understand this clearly. Epaminondas does not look at the world, the state, or a battle as other men do. He sees pure mathematical equations where others see only a chaotic, bloody clash of shields. If you are nervous, hide it behind a mask of discipline. If you are confused, ask, but do not lie to him. He can read a man's intent by the mere set of his shoulders. He is the architect of our hegemony," Pamenes added softly, his tone turning grave. "But he is also a profound student of the human soul. He will not just test your spear arm or your tactical memory. He will test your logic. He firmly believes that a general's greatest weapon is not the phalanx itself, but the brilliant calculating mind that directs it." Amyntor sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the flickering flame of the brazier. "A mind that directs the phalanx," Amyntor brooded inwardly, a dark, ambitious spark igniting behind his eyes. If the Thebans can engineer a mind like that out of dust and discipline, so can we. As the dinner wound down and the diluted wine cups were cleared away by the enslaved attendants, Philip remained in a state of high-strung electric focus. The prospect of meeting the greatest tactical mind in the entire Greek world was a dizzying universe away from the idle, fearful hostage life he had anticipated when he first left Pella. Later that night, unable to sleep, Philip walked to the arched stone window of his quarters, looking up toward the towering citadel of the Cadmea, where a few distant, solitary torchlights still flickered against the starless night. He felt the crushing, monumental responsibility of the moment pressing down on his chest. It wasn't just about his own personal performance tomorrow. It was about the lasting impression these foreign masters would form of all the Macedonian boys. Across the room, Antigonus was still awake, sharpening the edge of a small utility knife with a slow, rhythmic shing, shing, while Peithon and Leonnatus reviewed wax tablets inscribed with formation geometries. Philip turned back to the stack of wax tablets on his desk, his mind racing wildly through the lessons of the past grueling days. What is he looking for? Philip wondered silently, staring at the wax. Is it the raw strength of our formation, or the cold clarity of our reasoning? He began to redraw the diagrams of the oblique wing once more by lamplight, trying desperately to anticipate the complex, probing questions the great strategist might pose at dawn. He knew with absolute certainty that he had to be ready to deliver whatever profound insight Epaminondas sought, proving once and for all that the rugged North was fully capable of the same disciplined, harmonious brilliance that had made Thebes the master of Greece. To be continued in Episode 9, Shadow of the Strategist. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Talesia's Playlist. Volume 2, Iolaus, the Sacred Band Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 2. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.